One bait is kind of a southern staple cold water bait, and it's a bait I actually have tied on from October when it gets cool all the way until the shad spawn, even into like the early summer, you know, late spring, and that is an underspin. So this underspin, this is actually a homemade one. I like to make my own underspins.
I made it myself.
It's a horsehead style with a little bit longer arm that attaches to the blade. And what that longer arm does is it allows that blade to spin no matter what size bait you put on here. A lot of times if you don't put a real thin bait on a lot of the underspins out there, then the blade won't spin. And this arm being stretched out a little bit will make that bait spin, or the blade spin, no matter how fat the bait is. Problem is, nowadays on a lot of these lakes around here, the fish are really, really pressured. And what they do is you'll be reeling your underspin along. You know, I put a Super Fluke Junior on it. I'll put a paddle tail swim bait if they're a little shallower. But I have my Super Fluke Junior on it and I'm reeling it really, really slow. You want to kind of creep it on the bottom, or at least very, very close to the bottom. The fish will just knock the heck out of it. You're just reeling it and you feel thump, miss them, thump and miss them, and you can't figure out what's going on. Well, what the fish tend to do is they like to eat this blade, and they're very, very hard to hook when they eat this blade. But there's a trick that a lot of us spotted bass, you know, Lake Lanier, Hartwell guys do on these underspins to hook more of these fish. You can actually add a trailer hook to this bait and makes a big difference. But you don't put the trailer hook where you think you would. Actually attach a drop shot hook to this blade and it'll still spin like nothing's interfering with it. So you take a, you know, a little bitty drop shot hook, like a number 2, number 4, or even a number 6 drop shot hook, and you attach it on the cup side of this blade, right on this split ring, and the blade will still spin. Then when fish hit that blade, you'll hook them. But you have to be careful with it because it gets hung a lot. Like if you're dragging it through brush or anything like that, you're going to get hung. So it's more of kind of open sandy bottom, which is where you throw this underspin a lot, is in the center of ditches, kind of clean bottom areas. But this is a real effective way to get them when they're eating this blade. You have to be careful in some tournaments, because tournaments that don't allow Alabama rigs, things like that, like on the Elite Series, we are not allowed to do this. But it's a real effective way when you're fun fishing, or even in local tournaments, you know, where they don't have the Alabama rig type rules, to add this hook to this blade and you'll catch a lot more fish. This bait is a really, really cool bait, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions on how you fish it. It can be a suspended fish bait. I know I've seen people up north catching a smallmouth a lot off suspended bait on this underspin, but in the south, especially the areas I normally throw it, this bait is a little unique because it's a shad style bait, but you actually essentially drag it on the bottom. To effectively fish this bait, you almost want contact with the bottom the entire time. And it's, I do a lot of dragging with it almost, and then also just a slow, steady, painfully slow retrieve. But this is a phenomenal bait when fish get in ditches, get out on bait, you know, anywhere you'd use a drop shot, you know, a football jig, anywhere you got a lot of fish out deep, you can actually back off of them where you might be fishing vertical and kind of drag this bait really, really slow through them. A lot of times they'll catch the bigger fish in the schools, and it'll keep you from getting over those fish and maybe breaking some schools of fish up out deep. Different baits I use on this. So in my mind, there's 2 options on your underspin. You've got your, you know, fluke style bait. I use a Super Fluke Junior, just a straight tail fluke style bait, and this bait is a lot better when you're fishing deep. If I'm fishing, you know, 18 plus feet, I like this bait because it'll stay on the bottom much, much easier. You get a swim bait, something like that, it wants to rise on you. So I like a straight tail bait when I'm fishing really, really deep with it, and it lets you fish it just slightly quicker, still very, very slow, but slightly quicker and stay on the bottom. If I'm wanting to throw it, you know, I throw it up in the shad spawn, or I'm throwing it in maybe the back of some ditches, or up in less than 18 feet, essentially. I mean, I've thrown in 5-6 feet before. I like a paddle tail swim bait. And any type of little swim bait is effective on it, but you gotta keep in mind it's going to rise. So you gotta fish it even slower, even in that 10, 12 foot of water. You gotta fish it very, very slow to keep that bait on the bottom the way it really, really needs to be fished. And I use small baits almost all the time. It's actually funny, out of all the fishing lures we have, you know, we use 1/8 ounce, 3/16, 1/4 ounce. We use all kind of different weights for everything. When it comes to underspin fishing, when I create my own underspins, when I pour them, I make one size, and that is 3/8 of an ounce. That is, in my opinion, if I want it to be shallower, I use the bigger, the fatter swim baits. If I want it to be deeper, I use the narrower fluke style baits, but I stick with 3/8 ounce. So when it comes to your setup on the underspin, light line is incredibly more effective than heavier for this bait. It's got a decent sized hook, so you can get away with some heavier line as far as the hook goes. But now with front facing sonar, like I said, the fish stay on the bottom on this, and you can actually see it really, really well. If you go up to 12-pound versus 10-pound test, it is incredible how much slower you have to fish this bait to keep it on the bottom. So I like 10-pound test, a lighter rod. I use bait casting gear, but I never ever go heavier than 10-pound test on an underspin, because keeping it on the bottom is essential, and the heavier the line, the more drag and the more it comes up off the bottom. So light line's really essential for that. There's a few little tweaks and tips to make this a much more effective bait.